Okay, so today we're looking at white writing, and this is the only poem other than A Dreaming Week which I'm going to look at, which comes after Stafford Girls' Hi. At least it's the only one I plan to look at. If you have any particular requests, I will consider doing them, but this will probably be my final one of those poems after Stafford Girls' Hi. So, white writing. Now, white writing is quite a technical poem for Duffy. So, unusually for Duffy, she actually uses a set syllable structure. So each of the first lines has 7 syllables, the second and third lines have 4 syllables, and the final line has 10 syllables. And this is relatively atypical for Duffy. And even this isn't completely adhered to. So this final line, palm against palm, lifeline, heartline, isn't 10 syllables. And none of this really applies to the final stanza, which is a bit of an oddball because it is a complete inversion, actually, of the other stanzas. Now, something which you won't be able to see on here, but if you look in your collection, is that white writing follows directly on from A Dreaming Week. And just interesting to note that A Dreaming Week has a lot of focus on black, the colour black. So there are images of all colours fading to black. There's a date with the glamorous dark, midnight, black silk of night. That's all in Dreaming Week. And then in the very next poem, Duffy contrasts all of that with white. And it's just an interesting thing if you're looking at macro structure for the collection. That comparison of quite simply black and white. The other thing, going back to this structure with the syllables, is that although it's atypical for Duffy, it is typical of literature, or poetry at least, certainly pre-1900, really pre-1945. For several hundred years, a lot of poetry would have had a fixed number of syllables in the line, fitting them with their fixed metre. Another thing about this poem is it is an epithalamion. I think that's how you spell it. And basically that's a fancy word for saying that it's a poem designed for a wedding. And automatically the colour white links you in with that theme, white wedding dress, very clear. But the main theme in this poem is about Duffy being a homosexual, Duffy being a lesbian. Because what she's highlighting is how lesbians, gay, LGBT are restricted. So I've got a few notes that I'm going to go through, and I hope that they will be helpful. So starting off with the repetition of no, and what that does is it isolates. because each stanza, apart from the final stanza, most of the time when I'm referring to all the stanzas, that's all the stanzas except for this last one, because the last one has to be handled separately because it's such a different kettle of fish. But each of these stanzas begins no, and no isolates. It isolates the LGBT community, and it represents the barriers that they face, and also potentially that those barriers are arbitrary. They're enshrined, they might be enshrined in law, they might be de facto, which is just society, but they're quite arbitrary. And even in the final stanza, we still have the use of the no to isolate. There's a very strong structure to this poem, in addition to the syllables, in addition to the fact that, as you can see, each stanza is 4 lines. That's quite typical of Duffy, to have a set number of lines in a stanza. But it's completely, because if you look at these first lines, there are only 2 words which change. So it's no something written to something you. Sorry, I shouldn't have used yellow, it's not a particularly good colour. But it's quite regimented, this, yeah. Whether that's laws, rules, news, prayers, vows, all of them exclude LGBT. And it's worth remembering at this point that when Duffy was writing, this was 2001, 2002, and this was before civil partnerships, let alone gay marriage. So it's actually quite a big deal. It is a big deal that these people have very few rights. They can't marry, they can't even have a civil partnership, which would give them some of the rights of a married couple. So one thing I wondered, and it might be going a bit far, but I looked at whether the repetition and refrain could be used to highlight frustration and possibly the regimented manner of legal proceedings. It's the idea of red tape. So that might be going a bit far. That is something that I wondered about, whether that was a symbol of those restrictions. Throughout the other refrain we have is this, I write them white. And there's a real irony in I write them white, because when you're reading it from the collection, it's written in black. Obviously on here it is written in black originally, and I'm using colour to help identify things. But if she were to write them white, then obviously on white paper, which is normal, they would be invisible. So she's writing these, and she's writing them in defiance. She's taking that power, but they can't be seen. They're hidden, invisible, and quite literally, when it comes to the law, they are meaningless. And that's really poignant, because she's saying, actually, we can try as an LGBT community, you can try and have our own ways, but because they aren't recognised in law, they're meaningless. And the other thing that comes in with the idea of white writing is, I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce her name, but you've got Sisu, and her concept of écriture féminine, and in écriture féminine she talks about the idea of women writing with white ink. So what Sisu does in that is she suggests that it's not just LGBT who are restricted, who have to write in white, but actually women as a whole. This is a key argument in the idea of feminist literary theory. So critics such as Gilbert and Gubar and Gubar, they talk about, whether women have had to write through time with the pen of a man, and a similar sort of idea. If you want to be looking at AO5 and looking for alternative interpretations in terms of literary theory, this is a really good poem to do it for, because you've got feminist literary theory, and tied in with that you've got gender theory. So feminist literary theory is effectively a type of gender theory, and as is queer theory. Which is effectively looking at LGBT. So if you have an interest in the idea of gender theory, this is a really good poem to consider. And there are even, you can bring in some ideas of eco-feminism. So words on the wind, chase with the stick while we walk on the sand, foam on the wave as we lift up our skirts in the sea, the last golden sun. Those all tie in with the idea of ecofeminism. Which is not something I'm going to go through, but if you are interested in the term, I would encourage you to go and research it for yourself. Now, for the connotations of white, I've got a list similar to when I was looking at the connotations of the colour of red in tall. And again, this list of connotations is actually from my work on The Handmaid's Tale, just an example of intertextuality, which is a good thing to mention if you want to meet AO4 if you're doing the A-level syllabus. Now, returning to home, the other thing which I wanted to pick up before I go through the poem sort of stanza by stanza is just the idea of you, and just being aware that you could be either singular or plural, and considering how that changes the meaning, because obviously if this is singular, then you've got Duffy talking directly to probably her lover, whereas if you've got that idea as plural, then she would be potentially addressing a crowd. To define the establishment. So, automatically you've got no vowels written to wed you, but you've got the contradiction of that light in the soft hours of our marriage years. Wed, married, it's just a desire for marriage and that defiance. Also, marriage is, because gay marriage is new, it was only legalised in 2014, when it was only civil partnerships that were available. Marriage would not have been the correct term. And automatically there's my lips on yours. It creates a sense of intimacy, it's personal, and it reminds us that this is a love poem. No prayers written to bless you, so prayers just religion. It's also quite a comfort, and the idea of blessing, it's, to me, bless gives the impression of approval. So I think what she's saying in the second stanza is that actually no one approves of you. So your soul aflame is a reminder of passion and how, LGBT relationships can be passionate. And that's okay. That's how it is. And bright in the window of your maiden name. So we've got this rhyme between flame and name, which highlights it. And the idea of maiden name, because obviously your maiden name is the name a woman has traditionally before they're married. This is less the case now with double-barreled surnames, or sometimes the man will take the woman's name. But so that's tradition. And highlighting how if you're a woman marrying another woman, I suppose the issue of whether you keep your maiden names, whether you, and if not, which one you choose, or whether you double barrel it. Maiden is also a sign that you're unmarried, linking to the idea that LGBTs could not get married. And it also, if you take maiden, meaning unmarried, it also gives connotations of virginity. And certainly at this stage, although homosexual relations were legal, they were still very much frowned upon. And you've got no laws written to guard you. Now, often laws might be seen as restrictive, but what Duffy seems to be saying here is that actually, because there were no laws really around homosexuality, there are very few laws that did mark the LGBT community. They had no protection. They weren't given the protection under the law, which might be considered a human right. And that's really highlighting their oppression. So your hand in mine, relating back to my lips on yours. So you've got the space. So here it's my, yours, here it's your, mine, suggesting that link is both ways, that it's intimate, that it's personal, and potentially saying actually it is equal to any, I suppose, link between or a heterosexual couple. Your hand in mine, it suggests unity, and it's palm against palm, lifeline, heartline, really traditional, classical imagery. There was a gal in my class who suggested what I thought was a really interesting idea, that this actually links back to Romeo and Juliet, the idea of palm against palm, and the forbidden love in Romeo and Juliet. So shout out to Amy from my class. And then we've got this move on from laws to rules, and it's a similar concept that, you know, there was no guidance for homosexuals. And it is interesting thinking how relevant this poem is 16 years later, because there have been a lot of changes to the law since then. So words on the wind, traced with a stick where I walk on the sand. And that's relating back to the idea of transitory words. When you write white, they're invisible. If you're writing on the wind, then it doesn't really exist. If you're tracing it with a stick or in the sand, there's that hope that it will stay, but the idea that the sea will come and wash it away, and you've got the sea potentially actually representing Parliament, representing government, representing society, while those marks in the sands are a sign of innocence, you know, children. What makes me think of no news written to tell you. Now that's also an interesting one, because clearly there's nothing that actually stopped. There was nothing which actually stopped women from reading the news. But I think what it's highlighting is that if there was any look at romance, it would have been exclusively hetero rather than homosexual. And you've got the continuation. So in stanza 4, we've got the idea of walking on the sand. Stanza 5, we've got the sea, and beach is a traditionally romantic image. It's also quite a feminine image, but certainly you think of the musical Grease, think of the musical Mamma Mia. They're the two which automatically spring to mind for me. But even as far back as Homer, the beach is used as a romantic image. So it's also suggesting actually LGBT is normal, it's traditional, and if it's in line with traditional values, it's not a defiance of that. Foam on the wave, potentially an allusion to Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, who was born out of the genitals, or the genitals of Uranus, I thought to have been that from which Aphrodite was born, and certainly it's a traditional idea that Aphrodite was born out of the foam. Then, as we lift up our skirts in the sea, so lifting up your skirts in the sea, paddling, a reminder of children, the idea of innocence, and again the natural imagery saying actually being LGBT is normal. Curiously, we've got that plural our skirts, highlighting that all the people that it's talking about, we're assuming it's talking about couple, they're both female, highlighting that. And then we get to this last stanza, and it's completely different in many ways. The entire form is subverted, but although the syllables are distributed differently, it's actually the same number of syllables as in the other stanzas of the poem. They've just been distributed. So we've got 7 for the first line, as we would expect, but then there's 6, 8, and 4, which subverts our idea. And I sort of wonder if the last stanza deviating from the accepted format was a sign of attitudes towards homosexuality and LGBT shifting. I wondered if that was either a sign of what was happening or possibly what Duffy hoped would happen. It's the last stanza because it might be happening slowly, but there's still that hope. Got the last gold, the idea of gold linking to the wedding ring. See the last gold song, you're waiting for marriage, it's the end goal. And this continuation of traditional love imagery, nature, ecofeminism. That inked water is a good link to A Dreaming Week. In the moonlight, traditional female image. And then you've got these 2 lines, which are the lines that have been the first lines for the other ones. So no poems written to praise you. Duffy being really playful there, her idea that there are no poems written to praise you, that, yeah, this is a poem praising homosexuality. Duffy is a really playful poet. And then just that leaving you on the final note of I write them white, emphasising that actually it's not fair and that there is a lot of progress which needs to be undertaken before things could be fair.